The evening air carried a mix of perfume, polished wood, and quiet excitement as people filled the grand concert hall. The seats were lined in deep red velvet, and the lights shimmered softly across the polished piano at the center of the stage. Everyone there seemed to know each other. Men in crisp suits, women in elegant gowns, all smiling, chatting, waiting for the next performance. It was one of those nights where everyone tried to show they belonged to something fine and cultured. When the host stepped up to the microphone, his voice filled the room with charm. He announced the next performer's name, but the crowd reacted with surprise. A few people leaned toward each other, whispering. A couple of teenagers in the back giggled quietly. From the side of the stage, a young woman walked out slowly. She was dressed simply. Nothing fancy, nothing shining. Just a plain dress and worn shoes that had seen too many streets. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her as she approached the piano. Some people in the front row exchanged puzzled looks. One man frowned and whispered to his wife, asking who had allowed her to perform. Another shook his head, saying something about how these talent shows were losing their standards. The woman heard some of it. She didn't look up. She just kept walking, each step heavier than the last. She had waited years for a chance like this. The invitation had come through a small local contest she hadn't even expected to win. Someone had noticed her play at a small community event and thought she deserved a place here, on this big stage, in front of this polished crowd. Now that she was here, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a test she hadn't prepared for. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. The piano itself looked like a dream, a black grand shining under the lights, perfect in every curve. It was nothing like the old keyboard she used to play back home. That one had missing keys and a broken pedal, and yet she had loved it like a friend. This one seemed too clean, too perfect, almost like it didn't belong to her world. The host smiled stiffly, unsure how to fill the silence. Then he gave her a polite nod and stepped back. The woman sat down on the piano bench. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the keys, not playing yet, just feeling the cool surface. From somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "This should be interesting," followed by soft laughter. She could feel every eye on her. Her heart was beating so loudly she thought it might drown out the music before it even started. She looked out at the faces, rows of people waiting, some curious, some already amused. It wasn't anger she felt toward them, just a deep, quiet sadness. She had grown used to that look in people's eyes, the look that said she didn't belong. Her life before this moment had never been about stages or fancy crowds. She had grown up in a small apartment above a grocery shop. Her father had left when she was young, and her mother worked long hours to keep them afloat. The only thing that had ever made her feel alive was music. When she was a child, she used to press her ear against an old radio, listening to classical pieces late at night. She didn't understand all of it, but something about the sound felt like home. Later, an old neighbor had given her a small keyboard with cracked keys. She taught herself by watching videos on a borrowed phone and listening again and again until her fingers began to remember what her heart already knew. There were days when the neighbors complained about the sound, days when her mother told her to stop because it was too late, too noisy, too hopeless. But she kept playing. Music was never just sound to her. It was air when life felt heavy. It was the only way she knew how to speak without saying a word. Now, sitting under the bright lights, those memories flashed through her mind. She remembered playing on street corners during festivals, hoping someone would stop to listen. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they dropped coins into her small box. Other times they just walked by as if she were invisible, but she never stopped playing. The crowd in the hall shifted impatiently. Someone coughed loudly. The woman took one deep breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys. She could hear her own breath echoing in the silent room. Somewhere inside, she heard her mother's voice saying softly, "Just play from your heart, that's all you ever need to do." But her heart was heavy. She thought of how far she had come. From those nights practicing alone in her dim kitchen, using candlelight when the power went out, to this shining hall filled with strangers who had already decided she wasn't good enough. She wanted to turn away, to leave, to disappear into the shadows where no one could see her stumble. But then she remembered why she had come. Not for the applause, not for fame, but to play, because that was the one thing she knew how to do when everything else in life failed. The audience watched as she took another breath. Her fingers pressed the first key, just one soft note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. A few people leaned forward slightly, maybe surprised by how delicate it sounded, but she didn't rush into the melody. She let her hands hover, as if she were still deciding whether to continue. Inside, she was fighting against her fear. Every sneer, every laugh, every dismissive whisper she had heard since walking onto the stage echoed in her mind. But there was also another sound, the faint memory of her first song, the one she had written for her mother years ago. That small tune had always reminded her why she started playing in the first place. As she sat there, her mind drifted back to a winter evening when she was younger. The wind had been blowing hard through the cracks in the windows. Her mother was sick that day, too weak to get out of bed. The girl had sat by her side playing quietly, hoping the soft melody would help her rest. Her mother had smiled faintly and said, "That's beautiful. You have music in your hands." That sentence had never left her. The sound of someone clearing their throat brought her back to the present. The audience was waiting, still skeptical. She adjusted her seat, placed her hands again on the keys, and this time she didn't hesitate. She pressed down a chord, gentle but full, and then another, forming a simple, haunting line that filled the hall. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The people in the audience didn't know her story. They didn't know how many times she had wanted to give up, how many nights she had fallen asleep with her fingers still resting on the keyboard. To them, she was just another contestant. But to her, this moment was everything. It was a promise to herself that she wouldn't run away again. As her music began to take shape, the noise in her mind started to fade. The lights no longer blinded her. The whispers didn't sting as much. It was just her and the piano, the one place where she could be honest. She didn't know if they would like it or not, but for now she wasn't playing for them. She was playing for the little girl who once dreamed of this moment, and for the mother who had believed when no one else did. The melody grew softer again as she slowed down. She wasn't finished yet, but she could already feel something shifting in the air. The crowd, once restless and impatient, had gone quiet. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Her heart was still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something like freedom. She had started the evening as the girl they sneered at. But somewhere between the silence and the sound, she began to feel like more than that. And as her fingers moved gently across the keys, she knew this was only the beginning. The soft hum of the piano lingered in the air, wrapping the hall in an unexpected calm. For a moment, it felt as though the world had paused. The young woman's hand still rested on the keys, and her chest rose and fell with slow, shaky breaths. She hadn't even realized that her first few notes had already started to melt away the tension in the room. The same people who had sneered minutes earlier now sat a little straighter in their seats, curious but unsure of what to feel yet. The light above the stage cast a warm glow on her face. Her eyes stayed closed as she tried to keep herself from trembling. Inside, she was still battling the same fear. Every sound from the audience felt louder than it should be. A cough, a chair creaking, a sigh. She wasn't used to silence this heavy, silence that expected something from her. But she took another breath, and with it she began again. Her fingers moved a little more freely this time. The notes came one after another, uncertain at first, then stronger, smoother. It was a melody she had played hundreds of times before, one that always reminded her of home. It wasn't written by a famous composer. It wasn't something meant to impress. It was a song she had created when life felt too heavy, when all she had were her thoughts and an old keyboard that barely worked. That tune had comforted her through hunger, loneliness, and long nights when her mother coughed in the next room, too weak to hide her pain. She could still see those nights clearly, the flicker of a candle, the chipped walls of their small kitchen, the sound of traffic outside. Sometimes she would stop playing to listen if her mother was still breathing evenly. Then she would continue softly, so the music wouldn't wake her. Those moments taught her something about life, that even the smallest sound could carry warmth when everything else felt cold. The memory filled her heart now as she played. The hall seemed to grow smaller, quieter. The crowd's whispering stopped. The music had found its way into the air like a story unfolding without words. The melody rose, fell, and rose again, gentle but alive. Some people in the audience began to lean forward, caught off guard by how much feeling lived in the sound. In the back row, an older man who had been watching silently now folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. He was a music teacher. known for being strict and impossible to impress. He had expected nothing from this girl the moment she walked in. But something about her playing made him stop judging and start listening. It wasn't perfect, not by professional standards, but it was honest. Every note felt like a heartbeat. The young woman herself didn't notice the crowd anymore. She wasn't trying to impress anyone now. She had slipped into that world she always escaped to when she played, the one where nothing mattered but the sound under her fingertips. In that space, she wasn't poor, she wasn't untrained, and she wasn't the girl they laughed at. She was just herself. And that was enough. Then, as she pressed the next chord, something inside her shifted. A small tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't plan it. It just happened. The music had taken her back to a memory she had buried deep inside, one she rarely let herself remember. It was the day she had to sell her old keyboard. Her mother's condition had worsened that year. Medical bills piled up, and the little money they had wasn't enough. She had stood in front of the pawn shop, staring at the only thing that had ever felt like hers. The shopkeeper offered her barely enough to buy a week's worth of medicine. She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the cracked keys one last time before letting it go. That walk home had been the longest of her life, but she had never told her mother. She didn't want her to feel guilty for something that wasn't her fault. As the memory surfaced, her playing deepened. The audience couldn't see what she was remembering, but they could feel it. The sound carried sorrow, love, and quiet strength all at once. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a confession, a lifetime told through the language of sound. People in the crowd began exchanging looks, not of judgment now, but of quiet awe. The same man who had whispered earlier now sat perfectly still. The woman beside him had tears glistening in her eyes. No one had expected this. They had thought it would be a quick performance, something to politely applaud before moving on to the next contestant. But this was different. This felt alive. A young boy sitting with his parents whispered, "She's really good." His father nodded slowly, unable to look away from the stage. Even the host, standing at the side, forgot to check his watch. The hall, once filled with pride and pretension, now felt humble. It was as if the piano itself demanded silence and everyone obeyed. The girl's fingers moved faster now, building the melody into something stronger, fuller. Her body swayed slightly with each note, her eyes still closed. The music began to lift, no longer sad, but powerful, full of hope. It was as if she was telling herself that she had survived, that no matter what life took from her, it could never take this. Suddenly, one of the strings in the piano made a faint buzz, a sign of a key slightly out of tune. For a second, she froze. The sound cut through her flow and fear rushed back in. Would they notice? Would they laugh again? Her fingers hesitated, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. But instead of stopping, she did what she always did when things went wrong. She adapted. She shifted her melody slightly, turning the mistake into something new. The buzzing string became part of the rhythm, blending perfectly as if she had meant it all along. A few trained ears in the audience caught what she had done, and they were impressed. That quick change wasn't something you could plan. It was instinct, the kind that came only from someone who truly knew her music. When she reached the middle of her performance, she slowed down again. The song softened, almost like a whisper. Her hands were light, her touch tender. She was thinking about her mother again. By the time she had finally saved enough money to buy a second-hand keyboard, her mother was too weak to listen anymore. She had passed away before the girl could play for her again. That loss had left an emptiness she carried even now. As she played the next passage, she imagined her mother sitting somewhere in the back of the hall, smiling softly, proud of her. That image gave her strength. She smiled through her tears and kept playing. The music rose like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience was completely still. No one dared to make a sound. Even those who didn't understand music could feel what was happening. It wasn't about perfect notes or fancy techniques. It was about emotion, raw and unfiltered. It reached people in places words couldn't touch, Minutes passed, though it didn't feel that long. The melody carried everyone with it, moving between sorrow and light, pain and peace. Then, as suddenly as it began, the music started to fade. The young woman let her fingers linger on the final note, letting it echo into silence. When it ended, the hall stayed quiet. No one clapped yet. It wasn't because they didn't like it. It was because they didn't want to break the moment. The girl slowly lifted her hands from the piano and looked out into the audience for the first time since she began. Her eyes were red, her face flushed. She didn't know what to expect. But what she saw took her by surprise. The same faces that had mocked her earlier now looked different. The woman in the front row who had sneered at her appearance now stared with her mouth slightly open. The older man in the back nodded slowly, a look of deep respect in his eyes. Then, as if someone had suddenly remembered how to move, a single person began to clap. It was soft at first, then louder, joined by others. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. The girl sat frozen for a moment. The sound didn't feel real. She had imagined this so many times, but it had always been a dream she never expected to come true. Slowly, she stood up, her legs shaking. She gave a small, uncertain bow. The crowd stood with her now, cheering, clapping, even whistling. The same people who had once doubted her were now giving her a standing ovation. The host walked toward her with a stunned smile, unsure what to say. He didn't need to. The applause spoke for itself. She smiled shyly, a little overwhelmed, and gave another small bow. Deep inside, she wasn't thinking about winning or losing anymore. She was just thinking about her mother, somewhere far away, and how proud she would have been. The applause lasted for minutes. When it finally began to fade, the girl stepped back from the piano. She didn't rush to leave. She looked around one last time, memorizing the moment, the faces, the lights, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, not for what she looked like, but for what she could do. And as she walked off the stage, the host whispered to her almost in disbelief. That was something else. She smiled softly, nodded, and walked backstage. Her heart was still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. For the first time, it was from joy. She had done it. Against every doubt, every sneer, every shadow from her past, she had finally been heard. Backstage, the young woman leaned against the wall, still trying to steady her breathing. The roar of applause echoed faintly through the hallway, but she could hardly believe it had been for her. Her hands were still trembling, the same hands that had just held the attention of an entire hall. A few crew members passed by, smiling, some offering quiet congratulations. She nodded politely, still lost in a daze. For years, she had played for people who barely noticed she existed. Tonight, the same gift that had once gone unseen had moved an entire room. She sat on a small wooden chair near the back door, staring at her fingers. There were faint calluses on her fingertips, a sign of long hours practicing on broken keys. She traced them gently, as if reminding herself that all those years hadn't been for nothing. Her mind kept replaying the moment when the first person started clapping. She hadn't expected it. The sound had broken through her disbelief like sunlight after a long night. After a few minutes, the host walked in, his usual confident tone now replaced by a kind of warmth. He told her that the judges were deeply impressed and that her performance would be remembered. She smiled shyly and thanked him, her voice soft but steady. She didn't say much else. Words never came easily to her. Music had always spoken for her instead. When she finally stepped outside the hall, the night air felt cool and gentle. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and started walking toward the small bus stop down the street. She didn't own a car or any of the luxuries the other performers probably had. But tonight she didn't feel small. She felt seen. As she waited for the bus, she replayed everything that had led her here. The long hours at the diner, the small tips she saved to buy music sheets, the borrowed piano time at a nearby community center. Every bit of effort had built this moment. She thought of her mother again, wishing she could have seen it. The memory stung, but it also gave her comfort. She felt like she had finally honored her in the way she had always wanted to. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard and sat by the window. The city rolled by in soft blurs of light. A few people on the bus were chatting quietly, but she didn't listen. She closed her eyes and rested her head against the glass. The applause from earlier still echoed faintly in her ears, almost like another melody. The next morning she woke up early. Her small apartment was quiet, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the old wooden table that served as both her desk and dining space. The excitement from the night before still felt unreal. She turned on her small radio, half expecting to hear something about the concert, but there was nothing yet. It didn't matter. The memory alone was enough, but by afternoon things began to change. Her phone started buzzing, first with a message, then another and another. Friends from the community center were writing to her, saying her performance video had been uploaded online and was spreading fast. At first she thought they were joking. She opened her phone, clicked on the link, and there it was, her playing captured from a dozen angles by audience members. The comments were full of surprise and admiration. People wrote things like, "I can't believe this came from a newcomer," and "You can feel her heart in every note." She read them slowly, her eyes filling with tears. For so long she had believed her music didn't matter. She had convinced herself that people like her didn't belong on big stages. But now, strangers were writing about how her music made them feel something real. That evening, she walked back to the same hall where she had performed, not to play but just to stand outside and look at it again. It felt strange to think that the same place where she had once been doubted was now the reason people knew her name. She stood there quietly for a while, then turned to leave. Just as she did, she heard a voice behind her. It was the older man who had been sitting at the back of the hall, the strict-looking one who hadn't seemed impressed at first. He approached her slowly, carrying a small notebook in his hand. "You played beautifully," he said. His voice was calm but sincere. "I've been teaching music for 30 years, and it's rare to hear someone play with such truth." She looked surprised. Compliments still felt unfamiliar. "Thank you," she replied quietly. The man smiled. "You didn't play to impress," he continued. "You played to speak. That's what real music is." Then he handed her a small card. "If you ever need a place to practice or guidance, come by my studio. You have something special." She took the card gently, unsure what to say. "I don't have much money," she admitted. The man shook his head. "I didn't ask for any. Just promise me you'll keep playing." That night she walked home with the card in her pocket, her heart light. The streets were quiet, but inside she felt a new kind of warmth. Someone believed in her. For the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't feel lonely. Days passed, and her performance continued to spread online. A local newspaper wrote a small article about her, calling her the girl who silenced the crowd. People recognized her on the street sometimes, smiling and saying they had seen her video. It was strange but heartwarming. She didn't let it change her, though. Every morning she still worked her regular shift at the diner, wiping tables and serving coffee with her usual quiet smile. One afternoon, as she was cleaning up, the owner of the diner approached her with a grin. "I saw your video," he said. "You made all of us proud." Then, almost teasingly, he added, "Guess I can say one of my waitresses is famous now." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm not famous," she said. "I just played." But even she knew something inside her had changed. She wasn't playing small anymore. The fear that had always held her back had started to fade. A week later, she gathered the courage to visit the man's studio. It was a small sunlit space filled with instruments and stacks of sheet music. He greeted her warmly and showed her to a piano in the corner. It wasn't as grand as the one in the concert hall, but it had character. Its keys were slightly worn, its wood aged, but when she pressed a few notes, it felt alive. Over time, she began visiting regularly. The man taught her new techniques, but more than that, he taught her to trust her own sound. "Don't play to be perfect," he told her. "Play to be honest." She took his words to heart. Every time she sat down at the piano, she remembered that advice. Soon, opportunities began to come her way. A small local festival invited her to perform. Then a charity event. People started reaching out for lessons inspired by her story. She accepted only a few. choosing instead to spend more time practicing and composing. But even as her world started to expand, she never forgot where she came from. Sometimes she visited the same street corner where she used to play for spare coins. She would stand there for a moment, listening to the noise of the city. The memory of those days kept her grounded. It reminded her that music wasn't about fame or applause, it was about connection. One evening, as she was leaving the studio, the older man asked her a question. "Do you know what made that night so powerful?" She shook her head. He smiled. "It wasn't the notes. It was your story. People didn't just hear music, they heard your life in it." His words stayed with her. That night, when she returned home, she sat by her window with her small notebook. For the first time, she began to write down her memories, not in words, but in melodies. Each one carried a piece of her past: her mother's laughter, the hum of the city, the quiet ache of loneliness, and the warmth of hope. It was her way of remembering everything she had survived. Weeks later, she was invited to perform again, this time as a special guest at another music event. It wasn't as large as the first one, but she could feel how much had changed. She wasn't nervous anymore. As she walked onto the stage, the audience clapped warmly. No one sneered. No one doubted. They were simply ready to listen. When she sat at the piano, she smiled softly and looked out at the faces before her. Somewhere in the crowd, she imagined her mother sitting there, proud and smiling. Then she closed her eyes and began to play. This time, her hands didn't tremble. The melody flowed freely, full of light. The audience listened in quiet awe as her music told the story of a girl who once played in the dark, who had faced laughter, fear, and doubt, but had found her place in the sound of her own heart. And as the final note echoed, she knew she had truly found what she had been searching for all along. Not applause, not fame, but peace. The lights of the city glowed softly that night as the young woman walked home after her latest performance. The cool air brushed against her face, but she didn't feel cold. Her heart was still warm from the sound of applause that had followed her final note. It was strange how quickly life had changed. Not long ago, she was just another girl playing music in the corner of a noisy diner. Now people were inviting her to perform, to share her story, to inspire others. Yet she hadn't let it change who she was inside. She still took the same quiet walks home, still looked up at the stars the same way she always did, thankful but thoughtful. Her phone buzzed as she reached her small apartment. It was a message from the older man who had become her mentor. "You made me proud tonight," it read. "You didn't just play, you spoke through your music." She smiled softly as she read it. His belief in her had given her the courage she once lacked. She had come to realize that music wasn't about showing off skill. It was about touching hearts. And tonight she had seen that truth again in the faces of the audience. She stepped inside, set down her bag, and sat at her old keyboard. It was still missing a few keys, but she kept it as a reminder of where she started. Her fingers rested on the worn plastic, and for a moment she just sat there listening to the hum of the city outside her window. Then she began to play quietly, this time just for herself. The notes were soft and slow, carrying both peace and longing. She didn't need a crowd to feel the meaning of her music. The next few weeks passed quickly. Invitations came from different places: small festivals, charity events, even schools that wanted her to perform for their students. Every time she walked onto a stage now, she carried the same sense of calm she had learned through struggle. She didn't worry about who was watching or judging. She just played from her heart. At one of those events, something unexpected happened. After her performance, a young girl approached her with a nervous smile. The girl held a small notebook in her hands and said quietly, "I want to learn to play like you." The young woman looked at her and saw a reflection of her younger self, hopeful, unsure, full of dreams. She smiled warmly and said, "You don't need to play like me. You just need to find your own sound." The girl nodded slowly, as if those words meant more than she could explain. That small meeting stayed with her. For the first time, she started thinking about teaching, about helping others find what music had given her. It wasn't about fame or success anymore. It was about sharing something that had saved her. One afternoon, she visited her mentor's studio again. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, landing gently on the piano surface. He was sitting at his desk, looking over some old sheet music when she walked in. He looked up and smiled. "You're early," he said. She laughed softly. "I had a few ideas I wanted to talk about." He nodded for her to sit. They talked for hours about the idea of creating a small space where anyone could come to learn music, no matter their background or money. The thought made her eyes light up. "There are so many people like me," she said. "They have talent, they have heart, but they don't have a chance. Maybe we could change that." Her mentor smiled proudly. "That's exactly what music needs. Someone who remembers where they came from." Over the next few months, they worked together to make it real. They found an old empty room near the edge of town, cleaned it, painted the walls, and brought in a few donated instruments. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and full of hope. She decided to call it the Open Key, a place where anyone could walk in and play, no judgment, no competition. Just music. When the doors finally opened, only a handful of people came at first. A shy teenager with a borrowed guitar, a single mother who wanted her child to learn piano, a retired man who had always dreamed of playing again. Each of them brought their own story, and each of them found comfort in that little room. The young woman guided them patiently, not like a teacher standing above, but like a friend sitting beside them. One evening, after everyone had left, she stayed behind to tidy up. As she wiped the piano keys, she thought about how far life had taken her, from playing on cracked keyboards to building a space for others to dream. The journey hadn't been easy, but every hard step had been worth it. Not long after, she received another message that took her by surprise. A well-known music organization had seen her story online and wanted to invite her to perform at a charity concert for young musicians. It was a big event, one that would gather some of the most respected names in the music world. The invitation felt unreal. She hesitated at first, part of her still feared stepping back into that kind of grand setting, but her mentor encouraged her. "Go," he said. "They need to hear what true music sounds like." On the night of the concert, she arrived early. The hall was even larger than the one where her life had changed. The audience was filled with people in elegant clothes, whispering about who would perform next. She looked around quietly, remembering how small she had felt the first time she stepped into a room like this. But this time she wasn't afraid. She walked toward the piano with calm steps and a quiet smile. When the lights dimmed and her name was announced, a wave of murmurs ran through the crowd. Some recognized her from the viral video months ago. Cameras pointed toward the stage. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. The first note rang out softly, like the start of a heartbeat. The melody that followed was new, something she had written for this moment. It carried pieces of everything she had lived, the fear, the loss, the hope, and the gratitude. Her playing was not just music anymore. It was memory shaped into sound. The audience fell silent almost immediately. As she played, she thought about her mother again, about her mentor, about all the people who had once doubted her and those who had believed. Her hands moved gracefully, telling a story that didn't need words. Every note seemed to find its place in the hearts of those listening. In the front row, a group of young students from her music center watched her with wide eyes. They had come to see their teacher perform. Seeing them there filled her with quiet pride. She played with even more feeling, hoping they could hear what she wanted to say, that they could be anything. No matter where they started, the music swelled, rising into a powerful chorus before falling again into soft, tender notes. By the time she reached the final chord, the hall was completely still. Then came the sound she had once feared she would never hear again, the sound of applause, loud and full, like a wave washing over her. She stood and bowed slightly, her eyes glistening. The audience rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cheered, and some simply stood in silence, moved beyond words. She saw faces filled with emotion, people who had come expecting a show but had found something much deeper. When she stepped off the stage, her mentor was waiting for her in the wings. He didn't say anything at first, just smiled and nodded, his eyes proud. "You did it again," he finally said softly. "You didn't just play. You reminded them what music feels like." She smiled back, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I finally understand," she said. "It's never been about being perfect. It's about being honest," he nodded. "Exactly." That night, as she left the hall, the city lights seemed brighter. She walked slowly, taking in the moment, letting it settle deep inside her. The streets were quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and laughter. She thought about the long road that had led her here, the pain, the doubt, the endless hours of practice when no one believed in her. All of it had led to this moment of peace. When she got home, she didn't turn on the lights. She went straight to her keyboard, the same old one she had never thrown away. She ran her hand over the cracked keys and smiled. Then she sat down and began to play again. Not for fame, not for anyone watching, but just because she loved it. Outside her window, the moon shone softly. The world was quiet, but her heart was full. Every note she played was a reminder that dreams don't always need to start big. Sometimes they start in small rooms with broken keys, with a single person who refuses to stop believing. And as the final note faded into the night, she knew her journey wasn't ending. It was still unfolding, one song at a time. The morning after the concert, sunlight streamed gently into the small apartment. The young woman sat by her window with a cup of tea, still trying to absorb everything that had happened. The applause, the standing ovation, the faces full of emotion, all of it played over and over in her mind like a dream she didn't want to wake from. But what touched her most was seeing the students from her music center in the front row. Their eyes had sparkled with hope. That alone made all the years of struggle worth it. Her phone buzzed again and again that morning. Messages of congratulations poured in from strangers who had seen her performance online. Some told her how her music had helped them through hard times. Others said she had inspired them to start playing again after giving up years ago. She read each message carefully, humbled by the thought that something she once did to survive had now become something that healed others. She opened a letter that had been left for her backstage the night before. It was handwritten on plain paper. The note said, "Your music reminded me of who I used to be. Thank you for bringing me back to life, even if just for one song." There was no name, no signature, just those words. She held the letter close to her heart, her eyes moist with emotion. That was the moment she truly understood how far-reaching the power of honesty and passion could be. In the days that followed, life became busy again, but in a different way. Instead of chasing opportunities, she now had to choose which ones truly mattered to her. She began turning down offers that didn't align with her purpose. Fame didn't excite her anymore. Meaning did. She continued running the Open Key, her small music center, where new students joined every week. The room that once felt empty was now full of laughter, chatter, and the sound of instruments being tuned. Each student had their own reason for coming. Some wanted to escape their worries for a while. Others wanted to prove something to themselves. She never asked too many questions. She simply listened to their stories, to their playing, to their silence. Over time, they became like a small family bound by music and kindness. One afternoon, while guiding a young boy through his first song, she noticed his hands shaking. He was shy, barely speaking. After a few attempts, he stopped playing and whispered, "I'm not good enough." She smiled gently and said, "Do you think I started out good?" The boy looked at her curiously. "I used to make so many mistakes that people would cover their ears," she said, laughing softly. "But I kept playing. Not to prove them wrong, but because it made me feel alive. That's all that matters." The boy looked down, then tried again. His next attempt wasn't perfect, but it was brave. And that was enough. Moments like that filled her days now. She didn't measure success by applause anymore, but by how many hearts she could lift. Her music had once been her escape. Now it had become her gift to others. Months later, the Open Key hosted its first small concert. It wasn't held in a grand hall, but in a local community center. The audience was made up of families, friends, and neighbors. The students were nervous but excited, their faces glowing with pride. The young woman stood backstage, adjusting a few microphones and making sure everything was ready. She wasn't performing this time. She was letting her students shine. As the music began, she watched from the side. The little boy who had once said he wasn't good enough played a simple melody with steady hands. The room filled with gentle clapping when he finished. One by one, each student performed, and with every note, the atmosphere grew warmer and more joyful. The young woman felt her heart swell with pride. At the end of the concert, the audience called her to the stage. She hesitated but stepped forward, smiling as the applause surrounded her again. One of the parents handed her a bouquet of fresh flowers. She held them close, her voice soft as she said, "This was never about being the best. It's about believing in yourself, no matter what others say. Music taught me that, and I hope it teaches you too." The crowd cheered, and some even wiped away tears. After the event, as everyone began to leave, an older woman approached her quietly. She looked familiar, but the young woman couldn't place her. The woman smiled and said, "You may not remember me, but I was in that hall the night everyone laughed when you first sat at the piano." The young woman's breath caught for a moment. The lady continued, "I was one of the people who doubted you, but that night you changed the way I see things. I came here today to thank you. You reminded me that sometimes we judge too quickly." The young woman didn't know what to say. She simply reached out and hugged her. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. As the woman left, she stood there quietly for a long moment, thinking about how full circle life could be. Seasons passed. The little music center grew busier. Some of her students moved on to bigger opportunities while others stayed just to help out. She continued to perform at small events, sometimes at schools, sometimes at hospitals. Everywhere she went, she carried the same message: kindness, resilience, and the power of believing in oneself. Her old keyboard still sat in the corner of her home. She never replaced it. It had broken keys and faded buttons, but it was more than an instrument. It was a memory of where everything began. On quiet nights, she still played it softly, letting her thoughts wander. The music sounded different now, richer, calmer. It no longer came from pain, but from peace. One day, she received an unexpected letter from the city's cultural department. They wanted to honor her for her contribution to the arts and her work with underprivileged youth. The ceremony was to be held in the same grand hall where her story had truly begun. Reading the letter, she couldn't help but laugh softly at the irony of it all. Life had brought her back to the very place that had once made her feel small. When the day of the ceremony arrived, she stood once again at the entrance of that hall. But this time she wasn't the frightened girl walking in alone. She was surrounded by her students, her mentor, and the people who had become her family. The chandeliers sparkled above and music echoed softly in the background. As she stepped onto the stage to receive the award, the crowd rose to their feet in applause. She didn't see judgment in their eyes anymore, only admiration and warmth. The host handed her the award and asked if she wanted to say a few words. She took a moment to look around the hall, taking it all in. Then she said, "Years ago, I sat in this very place, afraid and unsure. People laughed when I sat at the piano because I didn't look like I belonged. But what followed that night taught me something I'll never forget. Belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you create. And once you find your voice, no one can silence it." The audience erupted in applause once again. After the ceremony, she stayed behind for a while, standing near the piano. The same piano she had played years ago still sat on the stage, polished and shining. She ran her hand gently over the keys, remembering that night when her music had turned silence into belief. Her mentor joined her quietly, standing beside her. "You've come full circle," he said softly. She nodded, smiling through her tears, and it was all worth it. They stood there together, not speaking for a while, just listening to the faint echoes of music that seemed to linger in the air. Eventually, she sat down and played one last song, gentle, heartfelt, and filled with gratitude. The notes floated through the hall, soft and timeless. When she finished, the room was empty, but it didn't matter. She didn't need an audience to feel fulfilled. She looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the night sky shimmered with stars, just like it had on all those evenings she walked home dreaming of something more. She realized then that dreams don't really end, they simply grow with us. The laughter that once tried to break her had become part of her melody, part of her strength. As she walked out of the hall for the last time that night, she carried no trophies, no grand expectations, just a quiet joy in her heart and the promise that she would keep playing, keep teaching, and keep believing. Because somewhere out there, another young dreamer was waiting for a reason to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, her music would reach them too.